Myanmar's military has told ASEAN to stay out of its affairs. It argues this would maintain unity within the bloc as it faces rivalry among global powers.
The response comes after ASEAN foreign ministers wrapped up a special meeting on the crisis. The ministers called for time-bound actions within the agreed five-point consensus, saying they are more determined than ever to restore peace to Myanmar. But the military warned that more pressure to fulfill the peace plan could have a negative impact.
Now for more, let's speak with Simon Tay, chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Simon, good to speak to you this morning. Let's start with Myanmar's military leaders. In response to the meeting yesterday, they've said an agreed five-point consensus is a long process and being forced to stick to a timeline will have a negative impact. Is that a legitimate argument? Are they genuinely trying?
It's not very realistic in the sense that it's been 18 months, Teresa. And I think that really, if one has seen some positive steps forward, then one could be patient. It is complex. But instead, we've seen more instability rather than any real effort to build a dialogue within the country. So in a sense, it is true that the heart of the problem is with the military and the NLD and other stakeholders in the country. But unless the outside world, not just ASEAN, but the outside world at the UN, among the great powers, see some progress, this pressure will grow on ASEAN. And ASEAN must therefore tell its member, Myanmar, that we expect you to show some progress.
Simon, the violence has been relentless and there's growing discontent within ASEAN as more people in Myanmar die. Some members, they want to maintain a non-interference policy, but others are really pushing for stronger action. What impact is this discord having on ASEAN's Myanmar strategy?
Well, Teresa, I think first that the non-interference shouldn't be too emphasized. We are interfering already. In fact, with Myanmar, even in earlier time, we had something called constructive engagement. So it's conditional. And here, I must say on behalf of ASEAN, they're willing to engage Myanmar. In fact, the mandate of the five-point consensus you flashed on the screen is to engage all stakeholders. The military want a domination, a monopoly of the engagement. And if you understand the complexity of the situation on the ground, not just politically in New York or whatever, you can't just do that. The situation isn't fully controlled by the military. On the other hand, there are human rights and other activists asking ASEAN to stop talking to the military. And again, this is very unrealistic. You can't do anything in a country, including humanitarian aid, without some degree of access and working relationships with the military. It doesn't mean anybody has to favor them or favor the other side. I think increasingly the common sense of engaging all stakeholders is something vital to move ahead with.
Well, Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan says it is time for ASEAN to make some difficult decisions to guide our next steps on Myanmar, adding that they discussed recommendations for ASEAN leaders to consider at the summit in November. Your thoughts on what those could be?
I think it's very important to have had the meeting this week. The foreign ministers, though, are playing a role of creating options. They have very candid dialogue. The final decision will be taken by the leaders in the summit. And there may or may not be a separate agenda item, but clearly even Cambodia, the current chair, sees the importance of doing this. And this shows you that Cambodians have rethought this. When Prime Minister Hun Sen visited, there was some argument that this would be somehow easy between the Cambodian government and the Myanmar generals. It's not proven to be. And I think this will continue into next year when Indonesia takes up the chair. So what we're seeing as we approach the summit is a certain time focus, but we also have to be careful about seeing how it will ripple into next year. Indonesia has been strongly critical of the position in Myanmar and will continue to be as a very vibrant democracy and human rights forward-thinking country. So I think that really there is a sense of slight differences of opinion in ASEAN. But among the 9 members, I think they have managed this quite well. This hot potato, hot coal of Myanmar is not cooling down. In fact, as the UN has shown, first it quieted down as Ukraine problem happened. But since July, the international attention has continued and grown.
In its 55-year history, ASEAN has never banned or expelled a member. But should Myanmar's expulsion from the bloc be an option now, or at the very least, some sort of temporary suspension?
Well, Teresa, I think that expulsion will be counterproductive in the sense that you do have to find some channel to talk to the generals. And of course, you don't have to praise them, but you've got to find some way to reach out to them. That's the heart of diplomacy and dialogue, the heart of all relations, not just ASEAN. But the key part is conditionality. So right now, you see the outcome already. The generals are not entitled to turn up in person. They must send a civilian representative, but they don't want to do so. In effect, we haven't really gone too far, but we already have, in effect, a kind of suspension, unless the generals accept certain conditions to show forward movement. I think that's roughly where we should continue to be. Where we do need perhaps some flexibility is with the special envoy. This has been wedded to the ASEAN chair, and therefore in some ways constrained by the idea that should the ASEAN chairman be meeting the non-government representatives, let's say the National Unity Government, the NUG. Clearly, the legitimacy of seeing Aung San Suu Kyi is real, but the generals won't let her meet anyone.
And while all this sort of talk goes on in the background, what does all this inaction on Myanmar from external forces mean for the people in Myanmar? We've seen violence escalate in recent weeks, and we're now nearly a year and a half since the coup happened in February of 2021.
Steve, that's absolutely right. That's why the situation is still urgent and not stable. And the generals do not have all the cards in their hand. So in making a deal with them does not make sense at this stage. I think that really this continued violence, the spiral downwards, is also having a huge economic impact. Recently, separately, the FATF task force on anti-money laundering has actually spoken up, putting Myanmar on the same list as Iran and North Korea. This country is playing itself into absolute financial and political isolation, except for its growing friendship with Russia. And I think if this continues, it's not a question of whether ASEAN suspends or expels Myanmar. It's kind of marching off into its own corner by itself, painting itself into a real position of difficulty.
Simon, very quickly, the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar put it bluntly, saying the world has failed the people of Myanmar. That's a very sad statement. And he says there needs to be a coalition of nations willing to stand up for the people in this country. Why has leadership been lacking so far?
Well, this is the problem why ASEAN is suddenly in the center of things. It's a hot coal that really Russia, China, India, Japan, just as the Asians could come together as a kind of concert. But inattention in the global conditions is very real. And Myanmar, having been isolated for so long, has a problem that's too difficult, too hard to deal with. And ASEAN's left holding the baby. Now, I think that this is leading to a global failure to really address it. But what in the end might the solutions be? Unless somebody's really willing to march into Myanmar with a sizable force and impose peace, it must go back to an effort diplomatically, using, of course, sanctions as well as incentives to create the conditions for an internal dialogue and, in the end, hope that not just the outside world, but the inside leaders see the need for some sort of compromise for the betterment of the people of Myanmar.
Simon, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much as always for your expertise. Simon Tay there, Chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs.